History's turning points are rarely found in grand war rooms or around the polished map tables of generals. Sometimes the difference between life and death for thousands comes down to a single pencil and a sweat-stained piece of scrap paper, and a mathematical error so basic it should have sent a soldier to a court-martial. Imagine this. You are at 8,000 feet, encased in absolute darkness. The temperature outside is 15 degrees below zero. You think you are flying home to a warm bed. But in reality, your calculations are backwards. You are flying a warplane like a moth into a flame, heading straight for the enemy. Heading straight for the heart of the enemy's most heavily defended territory. If I told you that this specific foolish mistake would eventually reveal Nazi Germany's best-kept secret and save countless Allied lives, would you believe it? This is not a movie script. This is the absurd, terrifying, and entirely true story of December 14, 1941, over the freezing North Sea. Let's rewind to the winter of 1941. The continent of Europe is trembling under the Nazi Button. The RAF faces its darkest hour. In this phase of the war, air combat isn't just a test of courage. It is a deadly game of cat and mouse played in the dark. The problem is the cat. The RAF is effectively blind. In an era before GPS satellites were even a dream and radar was still in its infancy, bomber navigation relied on an ancient technique called dead reckoning. It sounds scientific, but it was often a gamble. A navigator had to take the aircrafts heading on their speed, combine them with wind data from meteorologists, and manually calculate their position on paper. If you think this sounds like a simple math problem, you are mistaken. In combat, wind speeds change, directions shift, and worst of all, you have to perform these complex trigonometric calculations inside a vibrating metal can. Sergeant William Gregory, nicknamed Styx, was one of these navigators living on the edge. If you were casting a hero, Gregory would not be your first choice. For the war, he was just an ordinary grocery clerk in Nottingham. He joined the RAF simply because flying planes seemed more exciting than stacking cans of beans. His records at the RAF Cranwell Navigation School were hardly glowing. Instructors noted he had adequate mathematical skills, but tended to rush, making calculation errors that required additional supervision. In peacetime, needs additional supervision means you fail a test. In the Air War of 1941, it is practically a death sentence. Gregory was not a natural genius. He carried a worn notebook filled with formulas and correction factors because he could not memorize the complex procedures. In stark contrast, his pilot flight, Lieutenant Robert Braham, was a rising star. Braham was cool, decisive, and possessed that rare flying instinct that instructors could not teach. Fate had strapped these two opposites into the cramped cockpit of a Bristol Beaufighter, a heavy twin-engine fighter. At 2:47 in the morning, on December 14, 1941, their aircraft was cutting through the darkness over the North Sea. For Gregory, the flight was torture. Cold was the only passenger in the plane besides the darkness. The Beaufighter aluminum skin was tough, but its insulation was non-existent. The outside air was minus 15 degrees Celsius, and inside it was not much warmer. Gregory wore thick flying gloves, his fingers numb fighting to grip his pencil. His stomach churned not from fear but from the violent turbulence as the plane hammered through the air at 280 miles per hour. According to their briefing, they had just finished a fruitless patrol. Their mission was to hunt German bombers attempting to cross the English Channel to strike British cities. But tonight the sky was empty, a vast silent graveyard. It was time to go home. Gregory hunched over his tiny desk in the rear fuselage, his pencil scratching against the chart paper. It was the third time in 20 minutes he had recalculated their position. His hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. Something was wrong. Something felt terribly wrong. By his dead reckoning, accounting for wind speed and heading, they should have been approaching the English coast near Norfolk. His stopwatch indicated they had been flying for 43 minutes since turning for home. Theoretically, looking through the plexiglass, they should be seeing the familiar outline of the British coast. or at least the white foam of waves breaking against the cliffs, but outside there was only blackness. Gregory's heart began to hammer. Against his ribs, he looked down at his scrap paper, staring at one crucial figure. The wind drift correction. In that decisive moment, his mind went blank. A mistake simple enough to kill them both. To compensate for the northeasterly wind, he should have subtracted degrees from their heading. To steer the aircraft west. But exhausted and frozen, he had done the exact opposite. He had added them. This meant the aircraft was not fighting the crosswind, it was riding it. They had not flown west back to England. They had flown east, pushed 60 miles off course, deep into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. "Sticks, where the hell are we, pilot Brer?" A mess voice crackled through the intercom. Even through the static, Gregory could hear the tension. Gregory opened his mouth to answer. He wanted to say, "According to the math, we are home." But reason told him the instruments did not lie and the view outside did not lie. If they were really near, the British Coast Ground radar would have hailed them by now. Just as Gregory prepared to confess this devastating failure, to tell Braham they might have to ditch. In the freezing North Sea, Braham's voice suddenly spiked, sharp and urgent, piercing the radio static. "Wait, lights dead ahead." Multiple lights. For a second, both men froze. Lights? In wartime Britain, under strict blackout regulations. How could there be clusters of lights? Unless that was not Britain. At that moment, Gregory did not realize that his math error had just torn a hole in the Luftwaffe's most sophisticated camouflage net. He had blindly led their fighters straight to one of the biggest mysteries of the Second World War. You have to understand, at this stage of the war, British intelligence knew almost nothing about the launch sites of German bombers. The Germans were cunning. They no longer launched massive formations that British radar could easily backtrack. Instead, they used a network of secret forward airfields scattered along the coasts of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. These bases maintained radio silence, covered runways with camouflage netting, and built fake houses to confuse aerial reconnaissance. For the RAF, it was a desperate struggle. Between September 1940 and December 1941, fighters flew thousands of sorties. Confirmed only 12 kills, a dismal success rate of barely 1% against the elusive enemy. Every bomber shot down cost the British 18,000 gallons of high-octane fuel and risked the lives of highly trained crews. The British knew these bases existed. They had to. German bombers dropped tons of explosives on British cities every night. They did not materialize out of thin air. RAF reconnaissance planes risked everything, flying daylight missions over occupied lands, searching for these nests. But results word is mal. After 3 months of intensive searching, they found only 2 insignificant airfields. The real killers were still hiding in the dark until tonight, until Gregory messed up his addition and subtraction. "Those are not our lights." Braham's voice dropped low, carrying a chilling calmness. "We are over enemy territory. We are in Holland or northern Germany." Gregory's stomach dropped. If those words German lights, they were sitting in a flak trap. The moment the Germans on the ground realized they were there, dozens of anti-aircraft guns would shred their fragile plane. If German night fighters scrambled, their low-fuel Beaufighter would be a sitting duck. Fear, pure primal fear, filled the cockpit. Gregory's instinct was to scream at Braham to turn around, to flee this death trap immediately. But what happened next demonstrated the difference between a pilot and a warrior. "Sticks," Braham said again. The surprise was gone, replaced by the tone of a predator spotting prey. "We are going down to take a look." "You are doing what?" Gregory could not believe his ears. "I said we are going down to look." Braham did not pull up to escape. He slammed the stick to the left. The heavy Beaufighter carved a graceful leaf, a lark through the sky, diving from 8,000 feet. The altimeter unwound frantically. 6,000, 4,000. As they descended, the lights sharpened. Gregory unbuckled his harness, twisting his body painfully to peer out the small rear observation window. What he saw made his blood run cold. It was not just a few street lamps. It was a massive, illuminated city. No, not a city. The lights were arranged in perfect geometric lines, runway lights. Not just one, but three. They formed a massive triangle. Scattered around the perimeter were other lights, hangars, fuel, depots, barracks. Even more shocking, the runways were not empty. Even from this height, they could see activity. There were at least 20 aircraft on the ground. Some weren't taxiing, others had engines running, exhaust flames visible in the dark. "Those are bombers," Braham shouted. "Heinkel 100s and 11J U-88s. This is a major bomber base." "Sticks, this is exactly what intelligence has been looking for." The Germans were arrogant. They felt so safe in the secret base that they had not even bothered to turn off the runway lights. They never dreamed a lost British fighter would wander into their backyard like a ghost. But that safety lasted only seconds, as the roar of the Beaufighter's twin Bristol Hercules engines tore through the quiet night. The Germans on the ground finally woke up. They had a visitor. Suddenly, the searchlights meant to guide bombers home snapped upward. Blinding white beams stabbed the darkness, sweeping frantically to catch the intruder. Then the ground erupted. For Gregory, it looked like the end of the world. The peaceful night turned into an inferno. Bright red tracer rounds like angry fire snakes lashed out at them, weaving a net of death. Every explosion shook the airframe violently. "Hold on, Braham." He shoved the throttles to the firewall and the engine screamed. This was no longer a reconnaissance mission. It was a run for their lives. Braham threw the heavy fighter into violent, evasive maneuvers that stressed the metal to its limit. They banked left, then right, climbed and dove, threading the needle through the flak. With every turn, G-forces crushed Gregory into his seat, his insides feeling like they were being pulled out. But in this moment, with the Reaper's scythe inches from his neck, the grocery clerk from Nottingham did something incredible. He did not close his eyes and pray. He did not freeze. He grabbed his notebook and his pencil. His hand was shaking worse than before, but now it was adrenaline. He forced himself to stare at the lights, at the layout of the runways. He frantically memorized the orientation: 3 runways, triangular pattern, an estimated position. He had to remember, because if they survived, this information was priceless. He recalculated their position, working backward from the visual fix of the lights. He had to know exactly where this base was. Bouncing through flak, he scribbled the corrected coordinates on his paper. They were racing west at 300 miles per hour. The searchlights and flak finally fell behind them, the red tracers fading into the distance. When the aircraft finally broke out of the danger zone and returned to the relative safety of the dark North Sea, the cockpit fell into a heavy silence. Only the engines droned on. After a long time, Braham spoke. His voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the manic energy of survival. "Sticks, I do not care about your bloody math. We did something right. Remember everything you saw." They were not safe yet. The fuel gauges were hovering near the red line. They were still over enemy waters, miles from home. And they had just kicked the Hornets' nest. German night fighters were almost certainly hunting them. But the hardest battle would not be the flight home. It would be what happened after they landed. When the exhausted warplane finally touched down at RAF Wittering at for 23A, and the tanks were running on fumes. Braham taxied to the dispersal point and cut the engines. The two men sat in the silence, listening to the ticking of cooling metal. They had just returned from the grave, carrying a secret that could shake the RAF command to its core. However, they were not greeted with flowers or applause. They were met with suspicion, ridicule, and a career-ending inquiry. When they walked into the debriefing room, they faced Intelligence Officer Flight Lieutenant James Harrington. Harrington was a classic desk officer, viewing dirty, exhausted aircrafters with a mix of envy and skepticism. When Gregory honestly admitted his navigation error, Harrington's expression shifted from doubt to utter contempt. "Let me get this straight," Harrington said, his voice dripping with the arrogance of a man who sleeps in a bed every night. "Because of a basic addition error, you drifted 60 miles off course. You entered enemy airspace without authorization. And then you claim to have seen a massive, fully lit German airbase at low altitude. Yes, Sir Gregory's voice was dry, but he stood at attention. And you expect me to believe this base is right under our noses in an area we have reconnoitered countless times and found nothing. Harrington scoffed. Sergeant, with all due respect, what you saw was likely a Dutch town's lights or perhaps a hallucination. In a state of hypoxia and stress, you mistook street lamps for runways. The temperature in the room dropped. Other officers whispered, and the RAF navigators made mistakes, sure. But to cover up a mistake by inventing a phantom airfield, that was a court-martial offense. Sir, I have the coordinates. Gregory stepped forward, pushing his battered notebook across the table. I worked backward. I can show you exactly where it is. Harrington did not even look at the book. Pointless flights, Sergeant. Since you admit you didn't know where you were to begin with, why should I trust your backward calculations? If the math was wrong, then it's wrong now. It was a trap. How does a man who admits he was lost prove that what he found while lost is real? Harrington was ready to bury Gregory's career right there. Just as the debriefing was turning into a prosecution, Bob Braham slammed his hand on the table. The sound echoed off the walls. I know what I saw, sir. Braham glared at Harrington. That was a major airbase. There were at least 20 bombers on the ground. Heinkel's Junkers. I saw them. This is exactly what intelligence has been looking for. If it weren't for sticks, mistake, we never would have found it. The standoff was intense. Then the door opened. In walked squadron leader Derek Jackson, followed by a heavyweight Winkham Ander Basil Embry. Embry wasn't a bureaucrat. He was a bomber pilot who had been shot down and escaped from occupied France on foot. He was a legend, and he was a man who broke rules to win wars. He had heard the shouting. He had heard Braham's description. He looked at Gregory. There was no mockery in his eyes, only a sharp, piercing assessment. Are you certain of those coordinates, Sergeant? It'd stake my life on it, Sir Gregory replied. Embry was silent for a few seconds. He was weighing the odds. If Gregory was wrong, sending a reconnaissance plane to those coordinates meant risking a pilot's life for nothing. But if he was right, if that base existed, verify it. Embry turned to the room, his voice cutting through the tension. We send a recon bird tomorrow morning to Gregory's coordinates. If there's a base, I want photos of it on this table. If there's nothing, he paused, looking at Gregory. Then we will discuss the waste of a Spitfire sortie. It was a massive gamble. Gregory wasn't just betting his reputation, he was betting another pilot's life. The next morning, December 16, the weather was disturbingly clear. Reconnaissance pilot Flight Lieutenant Anthony Tony Hill climbed into a specially modified Spitfire. Stripped of guns and armor to save weight for speed and altitude, its only weapon was a camera, a belly. Hill's mission was simple: fly to the dot Gregory put on the map, take a picture and survive. Flight Lieutenant Anthony Tony Hilland is an unarmed Spitfire hung in the thin air at 30,000 feet. It is a specific kind of loneliness up there. To achieve the speed and range necessary for this mission, the aircraft had been stripped of all machine guns and armor plating. Facing a German fighter, Hill's only defense was to run to fly faster than anything else in the sky. Below him, the Nazi-occupied European continent lay silent and hostile. Hill glanced down at the map on his knee, at the red circle drawn by Sergeant Gregory's trembling hand. He wasn't just looking for an airbase. He was verifying a gamble based on trust. If that circle contained nothing but empty fields or a Dutch dairy farm, Gregory's career was over. And the Royal Air Force would look like fools for chasing ghosts based on a mathematical error. Time ticked by. Hill carefully cut into the target airspace, following Gregory's corrected coordinates. Suddenly, through a break in the cloud cover, he saw it. It wasn't a farm. It wasn't an empty field. The sight made him catch his breath. In the middle of the seemingly flat Dutch landscape, the camouflage netting was clever. But to the sharp eye of a reconnaissance pilot, the deception unraveled. The barns were aligned too perfectly. The hedgerows were too straight, forming a distinct geometric triangle. Those were not fields, they were carefully painted concrete runways. And more importantly, At the dispersal points, even in daylight, he could see the dark, heavy shapes being towed by tractors, German bombers. Hill slammed the stick forward. The Spitfire, like a diving falcon, screamed down from the heavens. His finger hovered over the camera shutter but unknotted trigger. Click, click, click. The high-resolution reconnaissance cameras whirred to life, the film spooling rapidly to capture the impossible. This was not a temporary landing strip, this was a hive. Germans were so confident, so assured of their secrecy that some bombers were sitting out in the open for maintenance. Naked to the sky, Hill could almost see the ground crews looking up in shock at the sudden appearance of the British roundels. But before they could scramble to the flak pits, the Spitfire had already pulled up, punching through the clouds and vanishing toward England. That afternoon, the wet prints were laid out in the photo interpretation room at our RAF Wittering. The air smelled of developing chemicals and thick, suffocating tension. Intelligence Officer Harrington stood over the light table, a magnifying glass in hand, his brow furrowed. Behind him stood Squadron Leader Jackson Winkham, at her embryon the man of the hour, the terrified Sergeant William Gregory. Harrington remained silent for a long time. His eyes scanned back and forth the glossy black and white images, searching for a flaw, for evidence to dismiss this. But the camera did not lie. Under the high magnification lens, those blurry dots resolved into the unmistakable wing shapes of Heinkel 111. The shadows beneath the trees revealed fuel bozers and ammunition bunkers. Finally, Harrington lowered the glass. He straightened up slowly, his face pale. He turned to Gregory, and the arrogance was gone, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. Gilze Rijen. Harrington whispered the name. This is one of the Luftwaffe's largest forward operating bases in the Netherlands. We have been hunting for this place for 6 months. We wasted hundreds of sorties searching the wrong areas miles away. And here it is, right inside your circle. A collective gasp of suppressed energy released in the room. This was not just a discovery, it was an intelligence earthquake. Winkham and her Embry walked up to Gregory. It clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. The commander, known for his ruthlessness, cracked a genuine smile. Good work, son. Your math might be rubbish, but your instincts just saved us. You just caught the Luftwaffe with their pants down. With the target confirmed, the situation shifted from mystery to execution. Now that the RAF knew where the hornet's nest was, they stopped swatting at individual bees. They prepared to burn the nest. The attack plan for Gilze Rijen was drawn up immediately. This would not be a blind night raid. This was going to be a surgical strike. With the exact coordinates and runway layout, British bombers could use flares to mark the target with pinpoint accuracy. For the next few weeks, Gilze Rijen became hell on earth. Armed with Hill's photos, the RAF analyzed the German operational patterns. It timed their raids perfectly, catching bombers while they were refueling or taking off. The base that had been a safe haven turned into a graveyard of twisted metal. German pilots who had mocked the British for being blind now looked at the sky with fear. They knew they were being watched. The destruction of Gilze Rijen forced the Luftwaffe to pull back, to move their bombers deeper into Germany, away from the coast and out of easy reach. This relieved the pressure on British cities. It saved countless lives during the Blitz. And it all started with a wrong number, a simple navigational error made by a shop clerk from Nottingham. William Gregory was eventually promoted. He survived the war. Though he never considered himself a hero, he rarely spoke of the incident. Perhaps to him, it remained an embarrassing professional lapse, a reminder of his failure. But on the scales of history, that wrong coordinate carries the weight of salvation. In the grand narrative of World War II, we remember the Eisenhowers and the Churchills. But today we remember William Gregory, a man who, by being imperfect, by failing a simple task, accidentally saved thousands. His story is a reminder that in the fog of war, luck is a skill of its own, and a beautiful mistake can be more lethal to the enemy than 1,000 correct decisions. If you enjoyed this story of how a simple math error changed the course of the war, smash that like button and check your coordinates. I am your historical navigator. I will see you on the next mission.